So the character for the walking has been set up with a parent-child relationship of a lot of different layers. So we'll just start turning off some of these layers so we can see what is happening and how they are configured. Now, it's set up to have a few parts to help cover gaps so that on the foot, just move this over a little bit so we can see the full name, there's a patch element so that when the toes bend, separate from the heel, so if I go into the toes and bend them, that I have a patch element that can help to cover the joint to make sure that right now, of course, if I bent my foot that far, something would be seriously anatomically wrong. But when we move it, then we can help to position it. So the patch is helping to make sure that as I pull it out, that line can still exist joining it. Now, if you have the premium version of Harmony, there's a tool called the Auto Patch tool, which will actually do this for you. And you're able to auto patch all of your joints. So then when you're moving your character, it can actually blend lines. Now, that also requires that instead of using the paintbrush as your strokes, use the pencil tool. And if you have pencil tool lines, it's able to then create patching lines. So premium can be advantageous on certain character types if you want the auto patching features. And of course, premium has all kinds of other super awesome goodies too. But we move up the leg. I have my lower leg. You can see how the artwork extends out. I have the knee. Now the knee provides some coverage so that when I start bending the leg, I don't end up seeing a big gap or gash occurring. And on this leg, I decided not to put a stroke on the knee patch like I did on the foot patch, so it's existing in between the two. And it may be in certain movements we need to change that, or we need to adjust the artwork a little bit, because when we start moving this, there are some gaps that are appearing that we may need to close up if they start to concern us. Now zooming out, we will see that there's now hips. The hips are now on top of the rear leg, and then we have the upper leg, which is following the same structural pattern as the front. It's really important before you set up the parent-child relationship of your layers that you use the rotate animation tool to reset the pivot points for each body part. Because if you set the pivot points and then start doing parent-child relationships, then objects are going to wander and move into really weird locations. So remember, we can set the pivot point by using the rotate tool and then going and setting it, dragging it to wherever we want, because it always defaults that the pivot point will be in the dead center of the screen. So we need to move that pivot point to where we need it for the particular piece of artwork that we're working with. Again, before you set up parent-child relationship, set the pivot points. After all the pivot points have been set, then start building the parent-child relationship. So attached to the upper leg are all of the other leg layers, the toe, the lower leg, the knee. They're all attached to the upper leg so that we can work our way down our food chain to allow our character to be able to animate and move in space. Now, when we animate, we'll typically use the transform animation tool, because that allows us to not only rotate, but also I can reposition to help control gaps and placement, because as part of animating a character walking, the hips are going to go up and down, the legs need to move around. So we need to do more than just simply basic rotation as part of what we're doing with the animation. If you add in keyframes that are messing up what's happening, you're like, oh, I need to undo it, So after you've done something and it got all wonky, you're like, oh shoot, I just want to undo it. F7 on the keyboard gets rid of the keyframe. So just remember that, and that will help out what we're doing. So I have an upper leg, I have the hips, and I have the lower leg. So these are the 3 layers of artwork that I have there. I have my rough layer that I started with, where I sketched in what I was looking for first, and then I drew my final artwork on top of that. So you can throw away that rough layer if you want, it doesn't really matter. Then I have a ground plane, which is going to be useful because when my character is walking, that gives me a guide of where their feet should be while I'm animating. The final element as part of my setup here is an item called my reposition peg. This is not a drawing layer, this is a peg layer. A peg layer is like adding a transformation pivot point that can then control other layers. Some rigging models require the use of a peg on every drawing layer. And some rigging models, you just have a peg to control a collection of layers. Like you may have a peg for the head so that you have one master point that you can now move the head around with. Or in this case, I'm moving the hips and the legs because now from this master point, I can move this around and it moves everything. And we will be using this because this reposition peg will allow us to now take our animation frames, repeat the cycle, and then we can now get it to start walking and continuing to walk across the screen. And we'll see how that happens in just a moment. Forward, what we want to do is we need to extend our animation out. And I'm just going to click out in the timeline for my leg layers and hit F5 on the keyboard. That extends out my animation. So that now extends those layers out. Now once I've done that, I am going to click in the first frame of the animation, and I am going to hit F6 to insert a keyframe. This guarantees that every layer we're animating now has a keyframe on it. When a layer is collapsed, so this is open, this is collapsed. When a layer is collapsed and it has sublayers, by collapsing it and then clicking on it, if I add a keyframe, it adds that keyframe to all of the layers. To create our first pose, I am going to click on the thigh of the front leg, and I am going to rotate that leg out. Now as I rotate that leg out, I am going to move it forward on the hips, and then I will see that I want to move the leg down a little bit so that it's in contact with the ground. Now I'm going to take the hips and pull the hips down a little bit so they look properly seated on the leg. I'm going to go to the rear leg, and now with the rear leg selected, I am going to rotate that leg out. I'm going to then click to the toe and adjust that and put a little bit of bend in because the leg is pushing off of the toe.
How are you getting to the other parts of the leg so fast?
It's really important while we are doing this to make sure we're using the animation tool, not the selection tool. If we use the selection tool and start moving things around, that's going to completely jack all your artwork and it's going to be all messed up and it will screw it up across your entire animation. So don't do that. Use the animation tool. If it changes like kind of pinkish yellow, it makes the artwork that you're selecting pink, the other children of that artwork yellow, you know you're using the right tool and it's easy to tell what you have selected. To rotate, you have to move to a corner and then you can create the rotation. You move into the artwork to be able to move it. Now I can see I need to pull that leg down so it's in contact with the ground. So I am trying to set my artwork up so that it can be in contact with the ground while the character is walking. So now I've created my first pose. Moving to the next pose, the character is going to step forward and sink down. At this point, we need to add in a new set of keyframes. To add in that set of keyframes, I'm going to highlight in my timeline my 3 layers and hit F6. That adds in the keyframes for those layers. So I highlighted and hit F6. With that selected, we are going to start moving to our next pose. Doing this, it's really useful to turn on onion skinning so that as we move the artwork, we can better see how it's lining up. So for this, what is going to happen is the character is going to, not skew, looking for rotate. I'm going to rotate on the lower leg. I'm going to pull the foot down, rotate that a little bit. And I think I want to rotate the lower leg a little bit more. Now as I do that, I have to move the upper leg because I'm trying to get some bend as the character is sinking down into their step. Now as part of that, we can see where the heel was thanks to onion skinning. And I'm lining the heel up so it's showing us how the character is moving. Then I need to reattach the hips, pull the back leg so it's still attached to the hip. And with this pose, I can now put a little bit of rotation and bend in the leg on that back leg as they are now stepping forward. As you do this, you can scrub your timeline, dragging the playback head to watch your frames play out. If the onion skinning is bothering you while you do that, turn it off. And does it look like they're stepping down onto that foot? And if it does, then you've done it correctly. Because now on the next pose, it's the same kind of process. I highlight my 3 layers, F6, and now moving forward with this, the character is going to then be straightening out their leg as they stand tall. So I am going to straighten the parts of the leg and then rotate the leg. And I think I bent the foot a little too far. And if I turn back on onion skinning, I will see where I need to put that foot. And once we do that, it becomes apparent how to move the hips, how to then move that back leg. And it's going to be swinging forward. And then we can click on the lower leg, pull it back, let the foot swing and drop. So we can see how the character is rising forward for the animation. Continuing forward, I'm going to highlight F6 to add in my next keyframe. I am going to turn on my onion skinning, go into the front leg, and now with this, as I was at my high point, I'm going to rotate the leg. The leg and foot is going to bend more at the toe than at the foot. Put a little bit of foot bend in. No, that's going to be too much. I'd rather put more toe bend in. But I now need to line up that toe. And I think that's a little too dramatic of a lean forward. Let's pull it back just a little bit. Now, as you do this, again, your character will vary. Your interest of how you want to do it is going to vary. There's a lot of flexibility as we work through this. Now, I like to think about something on here and it's a subtlety of paying attention to the leg is coming out of the front of the hips, but as the body walks, the hips are really rotating a little bit side to side. So as the leg is forward, that hip is forward, and then as it goes to this high point, it's going to become a little bit more centered. And as we work with the front leg now at the back, the leg is really going to be coming off more off the back of the hips. That's a subtle thing, but it now adds in a little bit of rotation without you even having to draw new artwork. It's just by repositioning your artwork in the animation. Now I'm going to rotate that leg up a little bit, put a little more bend. So I've stepped forward, and now my next frame, as I step out here with F6, is going to really be about setting up and putting out the front leg so that the character is stepping down. And now we can see that's going to require, we have to think about how that is going to move the hips, and then move the leg. Now I need to rotate this leg back a little bit, put a little bend in the knee, because we're now at the halfway point in our walk cycle. So I have to compare previous frame and make sure that makes sense. And that also is showing me as I do this, my hips and back leg or rear leg have to move further so that it fits with the previous drawing. If I turn off onion skinning so I can better see what I have created with my walk and go through it slowly and try and decide, am I happy with this so far? And I think it's good. So now I have half of a walk cycle done, and I just need to repeat the process until I get back to the beginning. That's going to give me a repeatable loop, and then we will be able to talk about a repositioning peg, which will allow us to then take this entire animated sequence and start sliding it across the screen, reusing it as a repeatable loop. Continuing with the point of contact, the rear leg is now made up the heel strike. So with that, I will select the heel, select the leg, rotate it, rotate the foot a little bit, rotate the toes back down, and if I put back on onion skinning, I can start to see as I move this leg, I need to position it. So I'm positioning the foot, trying to get the heel to line up so that the leg has stepped down. And now I can just move the hips over, pull the front leg from back there, and I need to then rotate it, bend at the knee, pull it up a little bit so I have a little more room to work with, pull the toe down. So the leg has pushed forward, it's sinking down. Next frame, we'll be going the leg straighter, foot rotated a little bit, whole leg needs to rotate and stand tall, and then once again lining up the foot. It's important when you're doing this that you don't slide the foot. If you each time you do a step, the foot is sliding a little bit more than it should, you're going to get some really interesting effects in your animation where it's going to start to appear like they're doing a little bit of moonwalking. And if that is not your intention, then I would encourage you to make sure to account for that as you build your animation. So we can see how it steps forward, and now moving into the next frame, F6 once more. And as the leg it needs to pull forward, put some rotation on the leg, bend it, and point the foot a little bit. Take the back leg, and the back leg is really going to rotate. So we're bent a little bit, push up on the toe. Once again, comparing the whole leg so that the foot makes sense. Pull the hip over. Pull the leg forward. So we can see back, forth, as it's rotating up, getting ready to then do our next heel strike, where then this leg can straighten out. Recognizing that at the end of the walk cycle, the first frame is really the same as the last frame, means my next frame here to complete this is going to be what my first frame was. We have the ability to copy these keyframes. So if I highlight those frames, I can copy them. I can now go to the end of my sequence and paste in those frames, and I can then, and my onion skinning got just slightly, I lost my previous frames, that's why it disappeared, and it was giving me a front frame that I didn't want. So now if I look at these three layers, I can line them up so it completes the step, the back step. So my first frame and last frame are the same, so now I have a loop. My character is now crossing the stage. We zoom out just a little bit so we can better see that. And see, turn off onion skinning, I can now see my character moving across the screen. If I want to set that on play, I can shorten my timeline, my playable area, hit play with loop on, and we'll see the character walking really, really fast. With our basic cycle complete, I'm going to demonstrate how this animation can become more flexible. Now I copy pasted frames from the first frame. I pasted it in at my ending frame because I want it to be the same, because it makes sense. It's that front leg stepping out, so it makes sense for it to be the same. So I'm going to undo that right now and remove that keyframe using F7. So now when I look, it's set. What we're going to look at next is how this peg, which is essentially an extra pivot point that can now have multiple layers and pegs associated with it. So these are children of this peg. So this pivot point, because I don't want the upper leg when I move that to affect the hips, and I don't want moving the hips to affect the lower leg, so I can't have kind of parent-child-child relationship within that. So I need something that's grouping all of these together. And we don't want to try and use a group option or anything like that, because that's going to make a mess out of things. And grouping isn't really going to help us in Harmony Essentials. In Harmony Premium, there's some things we can do in the node-based view where we do use groups. but in Essentials it's not going to be of benefit. So we want to use this peg. Now, knowing that I have a peg, pegs get keyframes because pegs don't have any artwork to them. All they are is keyframes. They're keyframeable pivot points. So I'll hit F6, I add in a keyframe at that point. Now, what I can do is I can collapse it, and I can even just highlight all of these frames. And on the keyboard, Command C, copy. Now I will move to my next empty frame, Command V, paste, and we'll see now my cycle is repeating twice. Now what's interesting to notice here is we have something going on that we haven't talked about yet, and that is types of keyframes. By default, based on our preferences, when we add keyframes, we're setting motion keyframes. So that means from keyframe to keyframe, it's going to try to tween in between those. But in this case, we don't want that. We want to introduce a stop motion keyframe. And I'm going to convert my first frame to a stop motion keyframe by clicking on this icon right here, the two dots with the line, and that creates a stop motion. And we can see the line in between my keyframes has disappeared. If I go to this next frame, I can repeat that process and hit once again, or I can right click and choose Set Stop Motion Keyframe. And we can see the line between those keyframes has left. So I have my first keyframe. Now in my next keyframe here, what I want to have happen is I want to move my artwork over. And as I do that, we will see, turn off onion skinning so I can scroll forward, and we'll see now my character, and I don't want that keyframe there. So steps forward and continues going forward. So it's waiting. So what I've effectively done is I've created a cycle, and now I have another cycle. And I can repeat that process, which I can highlight into these layers because that is what I copied from before. Or I can highlight even just these frames, copy those frames, Command C, and now I will go on the keyboard, Command V, paste those frames in, and now we have the same problem. We were here. Now we need to move that over. Click in the timeline, F6, turn on onion skinning so I can see where I need to go, and move my artwork out. Turn off onion skinning, and we will see that the character is continuing to walk. The fun part about this is with this, we have the ability, so I can now take this peg here. If I wanted to, you could see how the artwork. Now, I did a transformation, and ideally I would transform it before I start extending my animation across, but as you can see, being a peg, we can modify any of those properties. We can move it, we can rotate it, we can scale it, we can skew it, so we have a whole walking sequence. And because I walked it before I scaled it, well, we can put a peg on a peg as a way to save face. And now this peg, I'll hit F6, make sure it's a motion keyframe, not a stop motion keyframe. Now I'll go to the end of my animation here, hit F6 again. Actually, before I hit F6, go back to the first frame. Let's just shrink everything down. Try again. So now that is shrunk down my entire animation. Can bring it back to the starting point. We can see the whole animation has scaled. If I wanted at the end point here for the animation to get bigger, we can scale it up. And let's scale it up even more. Oh. And when scaling, it's useful to hold down the Shift key. So that it scales it proportionally. I'm running out of space on screen here. But we don't have to be walking in a horizontal line. I can move the whole animation up. So we're going down and up. So I'm able to, by combining together multiple transformation points, have a lot of flexibility in how I build my animation. In order to better illustrate the difference between keyframes, what I'm going to do is extend out my artwork. I just created a new layer with a circle in it. I'm going to add a peg to it. We click on the Add Peg icon. That now gives me a transformation point to work with. Now when I look at that particular item and click on its peg, pegs need to have their transformation points set the same way that drawing layers do. So if I look at a drawing layer, we can set its transformation point. We can now set the peg here. And as I have done that, now if we are using standard motion keyframes, so if I hit F6, I'll just zoom in a little bit here, and grab my animation tool, move to a new point in time, bring it over. We can see the line is here and it tweens. It automatically goes across the frame. Now, if I go to my first frame and choose stop motion, the motion keyframe has the little curving line, stop motion is the straight line. Now when I add in a new keyframe, I move that position, we'll see it doesn't tween, it just jumps. It jumps to that new frame. If I add in another keyframe here, by default it's using motion keyframing, but if I turn that off, move to a new location, maybe scale it up, oh, I had the wrong one active. Oh well, that's fine. So we can see the difference. Now at this point, if I hit F6, it's a motion keyframe. So now that transformation automatically animates or tweens over instead of jumping. So motion keyframe, stop motion keyframe. There's a difference between them. You need to use them accordingly. When we are doing the walking cycle, it's useful to set the primary movement keyframes of repositioning the walk utilizing stop motion keyframes, because we don't want it to be animating the cycle over there. But then if we want to transform the whole cycle, scaling it down or doing something, and animate it becoming something more, we're able to do that using a motion keyframe. One item that I neglected to mention is we sometimes will need to stretch out the spacing between our keyframes. So if I watch my animation, we'll see that my character is walking really, really fast. And that's probably not what I want, so I need to slow it down. And to do that, what we need to do is to add more space or exposure to each of the frames. So I'm going to just get rid of the frames and keyframes that I have here. I can clear those, I don't need them. Because now what I'm going to do, so I have my first frame that's here, and the character walks in. If I select all of these keyframes and I copy those, and maybe, and actually I think we can, I can now slide them over. Now these particular keyframes, based on how this was animated, do not need to be motion keyframes, which is what it defaults to. So I'm leaving a space of 2. Oh, that was over too far. 2 frames in between, so that I'm now animating on 3s instead of on 1s. And in doing that, we are going to find that the animation slows down to a much healthier pacing and doesn't appear to be so rapid as it works its way across the screen. So again, pulling it out. Now if I shorten up my loop, hit play, we'll see that it's now starting to walk at a much healthier pace. And I did that by simply dragging out the keyframes, adding a gap of 2 frames between each one. Knowing that we've been able to do that, I'm going to go to this repositioning peg. If I pull that down, we'll see my whole animation move down, lined up, because remember that is essentially a pivot point for all of my animation layers. Now what I can do is what I did before, where I can copy this and then I can go into those layers, paste, turn on my onion skinning, so I will be able to reposition this peg. So I want to reposition the peg right here so that it appears consistent. Now if I turn off onion skinning, we will see that the character walks right off screen at a much better pace. If that is still too fast, then what we may wish to do, instead of animating on 3s, is animate on 4s with it. But if we go too far, the problem that we're going to run into is that the animation is going to start to appear to be a little bit stilted or strobing, and isn't going to have the same fluidity that we need to work with. And it really does depend on how much you moved each frame, what your artwork looks like, and the end result that you are trying to achieve. But by pulling those frames out, we can see, even just winding slowly, how the animation is moving a little bit better. So this particular animation is working really well even on 4s. It just needs to continue out. So we can do that by, once again, highlight the frames, copy, paste, turn on onion skinning, and then reposition the animation so that the ending frame corresponds to what we need for the starting frame. Turn off onion skinning, and we'll see that the character is walking exactly how we need it to be. And 4 seems to be a happy number in this particular instance.